Hello and welcome to Agents of Nonprofit. My name is Alexander Lapa, and I'm here to speak with everyday superheroes helping nonprofits. Joining me today is Diana Farias Heinrich. Diana, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Alex. I'm happy to be here.
So, for people hearing you for the very first time, I was hoping you could share your superhero origin story.
Ooh, superhero origin story. Well, in the nonprofit space, I actually started out with a nonprofit called Saha Global that helps build sustainable clean water businesses in Ghana. And I used to be a project manager in a former life working for software development companies. And when I made my career transition, it was because I had fundraised for Saha Global to start one of those sustainable clean water businesses. And I went and I did that project. It was, it sounds corny to say it, but it was life changing. And so when I came back, I decided to change careers and really pursue something within the nonprofit sector. So I started volunteering as a photographer until I got my foot in the door in communications and development.
I don't know why people say that using the word life changing is corny. I mean, if you abuse the word, I mean, I understand, I think the sentiment is people overuse the word, and so it's lost part of its meaning.
Mm.
But I don't get that impression that you would ever use it in that way. So that's awesome. I mean, I find actually going to Africa is life changing, and I spent some time in South Africa, Lesotho. There it is, the country within South Africa, and oh my goodness, is that life changing? There's nothing corny about that whatsoever. I hope that this is obviously a sidebar, but if you ever get a chance to visit Africa, it is an amazing place to be.
And there's so many different places too. I know that that was probably my first. I would definitely like to go again and visit another country or two or three or four. It, you know what it was? It was on my way back from there on the plane ride. A lot of people, and I think this speaks to kind of like the nonprofit, kind of the older nonprofit communication style where it was like, oh, you're going to save the world by sponsoring this child in Africa. And that's not the sentiment anymore, right? We are not saviors. We are people, individuals, communities that come together and do things. And whether that's in Africa or in the States or wherever you are, it's not about being a savior. It's about being a neighbor and being in community with people. And so on that plane ride on the way back, like I was just like, there is so much left to do. This
Mhm.
was one thing, one project, and yes, it made an impact. And also, there's more. There's more to do.
We could talk a lot about Africa, just everything you said. Now I could unpack it for another hour to come, but that's not really why we're here today. So let's talk about the topic we thought about talking about. And before we get to that, maybe to help give us a bit more context. So that was how you started with nonprofits, and what do you do today?
So today I continue to work with nonprofits, but now in a consultant capacity, and I teach on ethical storytelling and fundraising practices. And that's because when I first started, right, my first communications and development role, my project was to write stories, like write biographies and photograph these 10 young moms who had won college scholarships. And of course, I was going to use that in all of the marketing for the fundraiser that we were holding. And so I do these things and we have our fundraising luncheon and we meet our goals and do all of that. And I'm feeling on top of the world, right? It's my first job in the nonprofit sector. Like I got to work with these really amazing young women who reminded me of my own mom and how she had raised my older sisters as a teen. And, so I was feeling really good. And then a couple of weeks after the event, I find out that one of those young women had been in a domestic violence situation and her ex was being let out of jail. And so, as a human being and also as a advocate for survivors, I knew that all of the personal information that I had put about her online could lead the ex back to her. And, you know, it was another one of those moments where I was like, there's got to be a better way to do this. And so over the next couple of years, doing more storytelling, doing more photography, publishing more of this stuff online, that, working with my colleagues, in every area of the nonprofit, came up with a way to make sure that whatever we published at the end of the day was something that these young women could be proud of, that the young women could be proud of, and that I felt that I wasn't going to put them in harm's way, as being the one that was always pushing the publish button. And when I started my consulting business, I decided that it was a thing that I wanted to teach people how to do. So I took all of that work and turned it into a framework called EquaStory so that, folks either, don't commit the same mistakes that I made, or that if they have a clear path to follow so that they don't do it again. Mind you, I still made a lot of mistakes and I still do make a lot of mistakes, but it's good to have a steps and process to follow.
I mean, we're all human, right? We're not AI just
Yeah.
yet. So we talked about in the pre-show. We're still human, so making mistakes is part of our nature. That's it. But the key point for any mistakes that you make is, apologizing, take responsibility, and then making the corrective actions as a consequence. But I
Mhm.
want to jump back for a second because it, I've noticed as well other situations where people get so excited about wanting to share a story that they don't necessarily ask whether they or themselves whether they should share the story. To your point about the lady from who was a victim of domestic abuse, right? It was a very if you publish it or as you publish it online, it was an impactful story. You're showing successes in the snap, but then all of a sudden, oh crap, there are some negative consequences to it that you didn't at the time maybe take into your purview just because you were so excited to share it because there was so much benefit to it. And it was only
Mhm.
after the fact that's like, oh no, there's some really negative consequences. So that I think is, I wouldn't say it's a common problem, but I think it's I was going to say a problem we can forgive you for in the sense of your intentions were definitely honest. But if you had that framework that you built since then, or you had that framework at that time, you probably would have made ask yourselves the questions that need to be answered before you actually hit that publish button. Would that
Right.
be? So you
Yep.
want to make sure that people don't do the same mistakes inadvertently, and your framework is one way to do that.
Right. Exactly. It's had I known the situation that she was going through, I wouldn't have published the story in the
Mm.
first place. But this was essentially what I was being taught. This is how we do things. If you can't talk to this person, like, just find out from like their, whoever on direct service is working with them and just write whatever. Um, but it didn't leave any room for, taking your time asking, like, I never occurred to me to ask, like, why can't I get a hold of this young woman? Like, what is going on with her? Because if I had done that, then I would have known the situation that she was going through and I wouldn't have published the story. And that I think is like the communication breakdown often between communications development and then folks who are providing program services, who are essentially, the ones that have the relationships with the people, with the clients and that's at the heart of the EquaStory framework. That's the heart of it, is building that bridge from the very beginning.
So you mentioned that if you had known about her past, you would not have published a story. And is it would have asking certain questions uncovered that, or was it one of these situations where even under the best intentions, it would have been like, I'm not quite sure how to phrase this question, so I'm going to be very delicate because it's a very sensitive topic. But the idea is, as you're doing research and in building a story, you obviously need to do a certain amount of due diligence. But
Hmm.
there's going to be a moment in time where you have to say, well, I have deadlines to submit a story or whatnot, amount of resources available to you, time and so forth, where, okay, now we're ready to publish a story. And maybe you didn't have that opportunity to uncover certain parts that you wouldn't if you would have been able to uncover if you had a lot more time and resources. But there has to be always a limit to that. So I guess the question is there a reasonable way to do all best efforts to cover, let's say, 80% of the use cases so that you can make sure that it can be, should be published the way it is? And is it okay to accept that there's going to be a certain percentage where no matter all the best intentions, there will be some things falling through the cracks? Or do you believe that, you know what, we can always, and I use the word always in quotes, 99% of the time cover all our bases in a reasonable amount of time? Does that make any sense?
Yeah, I wouldn't put a percentage on it. I would put instead, and this is the hard aspect because you identified it, right? We have all these deadlines and, timelines and jobs to do. But with stories and with people sharing their lived experience, we have to inject more time into the process of it. And especially at the beginning, when identifying folks to, who is willing to share who is willing to share their story, who can we work with, for at least a couple of weeks to produce something that, they are going to be proud of. We really need a lot of buy-in from all levels of the organization and all kind of parts or departments of an organization in order to do that. So it really has to be front and center, I think, for any organization, so that you don't end up doing what I did, and inadvertently putting in a harm's way. And then what I would also say is time, with relating to time, is that yes, it might take more time up front to work with someone so closely and telling a story that they're proud of, but it also can save you time on the back end, because I can't tell you how many people I've heard from that say, we produced this video or we spent months and months on this story and then they changed their mind. We can't, like, what do we do with it? And like, the hard truth to swallow is you don't publish it. And it sucks because you did, put a lot of time and resources into it, and that's not a question that people like to hear, or I'm sorry, an answer that people like to hear, but it's the truth, right? Because I might be cool to share my story with you today, but in 4 months, who knows what's gonna happen. And that's where you got to take your time with the steps. If you are in the first step of the EquaStory framework and exploring, then you are getting that background information about the client that you are potentially going to work with. That you're not even asking yet, do you want to do the story? You are asking your program, direct service staff, hey, we need a story about XYZ. Who do you think would be good for this? Like, why do you think that they would be good to tell their story? Is there anything going on in their life that we should know about? Is this a good time for them or not? And I think if you do more of your due diligence up front, you won't end up in the situation that a lot of people end up in, which is having something that you can't publish.
So just to unpack that a little bit, I mean, I say percentages because I'm an engineer, so I like numbers,
Yes.
and it gives me an idea, even though they're not exact numbers, it gives you an idea of what we're talking about. So apologies if I mean, that's just the way that I communicate. Two is what I would say is the thought I had when you were talking is, especially when it's not your story, you're sharing someone else's story, you have to take extra steps, right? When it's your story, you're free to share it because it's you own that story, so to speak. Versus if it's owned by someone else, someone else's story, there obviously has to be additional steps you take into place to make sure it's done the way that they would want to share their own story.
Hmm.
So, and I always respect people, even friends, for example, who tell me, they start talking about a mutual friend, and then my friend says, "Well, listen, I can't tell you so much because it's not my story to tell. If they want to
Hmm.
share the story with you, you can ask them, or they'll share it with you. It's not for me to say." And I always
Hmm.
respected that part of it. So that's kind of the essence I'm getting from this. But I would
Yes.
love to go into the actual framework itself because you started dabbling with that. That was my third point: is what are the steps? Maybe you can share with the listeners what are the main steps of the framework, and then we can go through each one and define them a bit more in detail.
Definitely. So EquaStory, it's Equa is an acronym for explore, question, understand, and approve. And this is very much putting on my former project manager turned communications publisher hat on, where that came from, because it's essentially like a list of check-ins, with your own work, but also with the client.
Cool. So let's start with the explore step. I mean, I know you already started asking or mentioning a few points about it, but what is the purpose of the explore step? Let's start at that level.
Yeah, the explore step is really getting all the background information. So you as the person publishing the story, what are you going to do with it, right? Like, because I can name off like 10, 15 different places that I could put a story online, on the news, sharing it publicly, but it's different whether I put something, on LinkedIn or I put something on Facebook or I'm going to do a pitch to like Good Morning America. Those are different. And so I need to know that because when I approach the client to say, would you like to share your story on behalf of our organization? I have to be able to tell them what I'm going to do with it. Because if I don't tell them what I'm going to do with it, then we get to the end where I need to publish and they're like, why did you put my story on Good Morning America? We don't want surprises along the way. Um, the other part of the explore step, right, is that kind of before I've even asked the client of, like I was saying earlier, talking to the direct service staff or whoever on your staff has the best relationship with that person, right? They know some of their background, they already know some of their story, and they're the ones that can kind of help us facilitate the conversation and they're also really good to like, so one of the things that I always love to ask them is there something that I should not ask this person about?
Hmm.
Right? Because once I get into the second part of the EquaStory framework where I'm asking questions, are there questions that I shouldn't talk about? Or things that I shouldn't ask about? Like to kind of bring it back to working with young mothers. Sometimes it would be like, don't ask about, their former partner. Don't ask about their parents. Don't ask about, XYZ because it was, very sensitive topic. And I'm not trying to put anybody, I'm not trying to re-traumatize them or put them in a state of like mental crisis just for the sake of an interview or a story. And that's the first step, is the explore step.
So if I were to summarize or at least take a certain perspective of it, it looks like it's more of an internal conversation within your team before you even reach out to the person you want to learn more about their story.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
Okay. And then the next step would be you said question. So what does that look like? What is the goal of the question step?
Yeah, so Q for question is really thinking about your interview process, your interview questions, and really the language that you're using. So at this point, you've asked the client, are you willing to participate in this, share your story on behalf of our organization? This is when you tell them, I'm going to pitch this to Good Morning America, or I'm going to do a series of TikToks, or whatever the case may be. You get into the interview portion of it and you ask them questions that are uplifting, worded in a way that is honoring their dignity. Instead of saying like, well, you know, you're homeless, what's that like? You would say something more like, you're experiencing homelessness, or when you experienced homelessness, what was that like? So being very mindful of your word choices so that you're not triggering, trauma or, accidentally belittling someone. It's just being very mindful of the way that you ask things because people tend to ask things that they really have no business asking. Like one of the questions that unfortunately donors would often ask to this group of young women who are also moms would be like, where's your baby's daddy? And it's like, is that really appropriate or any of your business? And no, right? You don't know this person. And just because, they are someone that is receiving, services or taking advantage of services doesn't mean that you have the right to ask them whatever you want.
Hmm.
And so also during this is being very mindful that if somebody's like kind of reaching back into their story, that there may be traumatic aspects to it. So how can you ask things in a way that they may or may not bring that up? They may or may not want to talk about it, but you're not forcing them to. So asking really open-ended questions. What's it been like your experience, before this program? What's been your experience in the program? What's been your experience after? At some point, they may tell you what brought them there. But, especially like as interviewers, it's like, the people writing the messaging. I know I used to have scripts and I would like prompt people with like, just really things that would set them up to say something about the organization that I wanted them to say, right? To show the success or to show the transformation. And that's not conversational. That's not dignified. Um, that's not letting you be the one that owns your story and letting you tell me what you want. And so with this question step, you've got to be very mindful of your words and also even of your environment. Because, often I would interview folks in person. And I would say, like, if you want to bring a support person, bring them. Sometimes that was their direct service like advocate. Sometimes it was their best friend. Sometimes like it would be their baby. And that's who they would bring with them. Sometimes I would go and interview them at their home and I would say, hey, is it okay if I'm here? Like we can, do you want me to open or close the door? Right? Like if we were in the office, like I had water ready for them. I had tissues if for whatever reason something happened and they started to cry. Um, you know, it was always my goal in this phase of the storytelling process to make sure that they were as comfortable as possible, not so that they would tell me everything, but so that they would feel comfortable enough to tell me what they wanted to, and even to not tell me what they didn't want to.
Hey, Alex here. I want to take a brief moment and thank you for listening. If you've enjoyed this episode so far, please consider sharing it with someone who would also benefit from its insights. It's these kinds of referrals that really help the show grow. You can also show your support by making a small donation. I don't do corporate sponsorships or product placements, so I rely on your support to keep the show going. You can visit my website, agentsofnonprofit.com, and click Support Us in the top menu. Thank you kindly. We talked about, or you mentioned, certain word choices. And I know that for some people that can be tricky in the sense of coming up with a better way of asking the same question, to your point about homelessness. Is there a resource? Do you have anything? Do you have any, like you mentioned scripts, but do you have any kind of, I'll use the word lines, questions that have been asked or a structure to the way questions can be asked to be able to get people to phrase their questions in a more mindful, respectful, with dignity type of approach?
Yeah. I'll point your superheroes to a resource from my friend Frank Velasquez Jr., who's an expert on using assets-based language. He's got a resource on his website that is an excellent way to start to learn how to shift your language. But also, like, I just want to say for folks to be mindful that we in the nonprofit sector tend to use a lot of jargon that people in like real life don't use. Like we're in our own little nonprofit bubble. So there was someone who actually gave me this example. He said, I was interviewing someone who had been formerly incarcerated, and I said to them, what was your experience like coming out? Like, what's your experience being formally incarcerated? And the guy was like, you mean like, what was it like being in jail? And so it's like, part of it is also assets-based language is being using language that lets you connect with people and not just yeah, lets you connect with people like on a real like human level and not so much on a professional level. Like lived experience and stories are not about being professional, they are about being human more than anything.
If you can share the resource with me, I'll be happy to put it in the show notes.
Will do.
Second point I wanted to mention out was I think you were talking about like leading questions. So not everyone is a good storyteller, right? Even though they have a story to tell, the way that they share their story might not be as I don't want to use the word entertaining or juicy, but the idea is that there are people who can take a very boring situation and just the way their enthusiasm talks about it and the way the words they choose, they can make it sound really, really interesting, right? And there's some people who can have take a very painful or interesting story, but just not share it in a way that might resonate with certain people. Part of the responsibility of an interviewer is to make sure that there's a balance between getting the actual story, an accurate representation of the story, but also in a way that can resonate the most, right? There's that balance there. Do you have any tips or suggestions, or is this something like you would normally advocate for saying, look, the person is saying their story, just take it the way it is. If you think of ways that you could improve or make the story more impactful, don't even bother because that's not their story. Keep it as accurate to the person as possible. Or would you suggest, maybe using certain types of language to be able to invoke or not provoke, but encourage a more impactful message?
Well, the first thing I would say for this step is actually send your questions to your client ahead of time so that they have some time to think about them. I often interviewed people who I had them kind of on, everybody's different. So some people would, tell me absolutely everything, and some people would say, "What do you want me to say?" And to the people who told me everything, I would say, all right, like once you get the chance to review your story, just remember that we don't have to include everything. I'm recording it now, or, it's going to go into the story now, but I might not include everything.
Just
And
like
to
we're
the
doing with this
person,
podcast today.
right, exactly. And to the person who said, what do you want me to say? I would say, you can tell me as much or as little as you want. I'm just here to listen. I'm
Hmm.
just here to witness. Um, and then we would get, once we get to the A step, which is the approve step, then we would get into that editing phase, which is, us as the communications folks, marketing folks that are shaping that story and shaping that message. We do have control over the editing process, but you don't want to over edit to the point that it doesn't sound, it either one doesn't sound like that person, or isn't true, or is like exaggerating things, or painting that person in an undignified way, because once they see it, they're going to be like, what is this? This is not the conversation that we had at all. Because I would often write stories where I wasn't writing their words word for word. I would take quotes. And then, of course, because I'm trying to show the transformation that, or the impact that the nonprofit has had. I mean, there was paragraphs in there that weren't about their story, that were about the programs
Hmm.
that helped get them there, right? It was adding that context around the story. And so, whether you have that person that's really, will tell you everything, and that person that's like wanting for you to tell them what to say, you've got to kind of find like a neutral space, and have like boundaries about what you will and won't share about a client's story. Right. And that really depends on what kind of organization are you? Who are you working with? Are you working with young people? Are you working with adults? Are you working with, older adults? Are you working with survivors of sex trafficking? Like it just really depends. And that's why I say, it really is more about the human connection than it is about anything else.
Third step is the question, not the question, sorry, the understand step.
Mhm.
The third step is the understand step. What's the purpose of that step?
The understand step is the one where you make sure that your client, the person who's sharing their story, really knows what they're getting into when they go public with their story. So with this, there's two tools that are key to any kind of ethical storytelling. And these I learned from an article called The Practicalities of Informed Consent in Development Photography, and that's by Nabila Idris. And so the two tools that are in there are, one is the stakeholder test. And this is the one about making sure people understand what they're getting into when they go public. So that sounds like, if like, let's say when I was doing the Explorer and I was talking to the direct service staff, they would tell me like, oh, this young woman, like she's obsessed with TikTok and is always on there, loves it. Okay. they're maybe like 17. So then when I am checking for their understanding, I use a stakeholder test, which sounds like, hey, if your friends were to see you on our TikTok, how would you feel about that? Would you be proud of that? Or would you maybe be embarrassed? Or I might say, I know that you're 17 right now. Like, you may not be on LinkedIn right now, but at some point you might get there. LinkedIn is a social network for, professionals, let's say. If somebody were to look you up on that social network, if they saw this story, would you be okay with that? Or would you not be okay with that? I had folks that would say, like, don't publish my story on LinkedIn. I don't know what that is. And I would, have others that would say, like, you can use it in a grant report, but you can't use it on any social media. I would have people that would say, use it however you want. It really doesn't matter to me. But really, it's that stakeholder test is about getting them into the mindset of like, who's going to see this? How is that going to impact me? In that article that I mentioned, their example is they wanted to publish a photo of a girl who had gotten married, was married off extremely young. And so they wanted to put the picture on the flyer. And in talking with the community, they realized if they published that young girl's picture, that she was going to get backlash from her community because of the cultural nuances. And so that's really why the stakeholder test is so important. And so you've got to figure out how to shape that to one, the way that you're publishing, two, the cultural context, and three, the sector that you are in, right? The specific nonprofit work that you're doing. And then the second tool is informed consent. And this is really weaved throughout the entire EquaStory framework and in anything that you do with ethical storytelling. And that is informing the storyteller, the story owner of how you're going to use the story, right? Am I going to put it on LinkedIn? Am I going to pitch it to Good Morning America? Is it going to, I don't know, be on a video that's going to live on our website for the next 5 years? Which I don't recommend. Or is it going to be, used in an annual report that's going to be turned into a PDF that's going to live on the website forever? These are the things that I inform every client so that when I do check for understanding, we've talked about it. We've really like put it into the context of their everyday life.
I would imagine, and you can tell me if this is true, but part of that step is also if you are talking to a minor, that you also get approval from the caregiver. And
Hmm.
there might be other people, or are there sometimes other people who you kind of want to get consent and approval before you get to that next step as well? Like maybe the story is about not just one person, but multiple people, but you only have the chance to interview one. The other person might want to say in that whether they get published or not. Or like, are there situations that you've come across where you need to get more than one person's approval, or you need to inform more than one person about a particular story? And how would you do that?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, there's a lot of nuance because the question at the core of this is, can this person give their informed consent,
Hmm.
right? So in the case of very young children, they might not be able to do that. I have a 7-year old. I'm like, if somebody wanted to publish a story about him, absolutely, they would need to go through me. But I worked with you know teenagers, right? Anywhere from ages of 14 to 19, and then into young adulthood. And so yes, we had consent from media release forms that their parents would sign, but if I didn't ask them themselves for permission to publish their story, I had no business publishing their story. um, with older adults that may have dementia or something. Can they actually give their consent, or is the storyteller, the story owner, a person who is a part of that person's life, right? So that's why we come back to stories, you have to respect the human aspect of storytelling and think deeply about who does need to give their consent. It might be the story owner, but it also might be their parent, or I don't know, their guardian, their children even, right? Because if we're thinking about, if I'm talking about my 7-year-old and I'm saying something that may embarrass him, do I need to tell him? Like, I'm very careful, even with my own stories, right? Of like how much of other people I share within my stories, even though it's mainly my story. But I'm thinking about long term consequences, and whether it's worth compromising their privacy. And there's no cut and dry, I don't think, for this step. It really is about looking at the whole forest, I guess, and seeing what are the different relationships that this person have that could affect what happens with the story on the other side. So just to give you another example, there's a young woman who had been awarded, or not awarded, but she had gotten housing through a nonprofit organization, for her and her daughter. And so they invited her to come to a small event, and they said, hey, like, can you get up here and like talk about what this means to you? So she gets up, she talks about it. And what she doesn't know is that they're streaming it to Facebook.
Mm.
And she talked about her partner, and her partner saw that on Facebook, did not like what he heard, and that ended up causing problems for her. Right? So our stories, yeah, like we may be the protagonists, but our stories would be completely boring without all the other people in them. So who are those other people, and how might it affect them, and how might those relationships change as a result of a public story?
So just to spend one more second on that particular example, you obviously, the woman in question was informed, or was informed up to a point. That wasn't informed it was going on Facebook. But with the idea, the best approach, would it be to have informed her that it's going on Facebook, and or to inform the spouse, the partner, that they're going to be doing this and your name may come up?
Yeah, so there's a couple of checks that you could have used along the way. So you know, in the step when asking this young woman, hey, will you, tell us about what this means to you? Working with her on what she was going to say, right? Having it written down so she doesn't say more than she means to. But in it, like if I was working with her, I would have said, oh, like you said this thing about your partner. And because I already know that I'm going to stream it, I'm going to say, we're streaming your speech onto Facebook. If he hears this, how might he feel about it? Right? And then having that conversation. Well, actually, I don't know if he will like that. You know what? Let me take that out. Or, yeah, no, it's true to me. Like, it doesn't, I'm okay with it being out there. In this case, would I approach the partner? Probably not. Because, my story owner is, the one that's reliving and telling her experience and not necessarily his. Can that still cause problems? Yeah. But that's where this thing is not, totally black and white.
Last step of this EquaStory framework is the approve step. What is that one like?
The approve step is circling back with your client and showing them what you're going to publish before you hit publish, right? It's the step where I show them either the video or the written story or whatever the piece is, and say, is there anything that you want to add, edit, or delete? And if you've changed your mind about going public with your story, that's okay too. We don't have to publish it. So this is the step where we kind of figure out if it's something that they are going to be proud of, or if circumstances have changed and they don't want to go forward, and that happens. To give you an example of this, I've worked with a young woman for many years and got to see her from when she graduated high school, and then she got two AAs. And so every like year or two, I would do an update on her story, and we would interview and we'd update on her story. And so the last one that I had published, I sent it to her, and I had written a sentence in there about her parents. And she said, Diana, this makes it sound like my parents really don't support me and don't support my son. And, I wouldn't want to show them this. And I was like, oh my gosh, you're right. Let's change it. So I changed the sentence and I'm like, how's this? And she said, yeah, that's much better. Like, I will show them this. And that was probably one of my proudest moments as a storyteller, to know that I had built up such a trusting relationship with her that she felt comfortable enough to tell me where I went wrong. And not everyone will tell you when you've gone wrong. So you've got to ask, right? Is there anything that you want to add, edit, or delete? You can still change your mind. Like putting the no option back on the table is so important in this process.
This is something I also do whenever I ask, for example, for a client testimonial. I finish a Salesforce project, I ask for a testimonial, and in the first message that I sent, I said, feel free to say no. You don't have to, just because I'm asking doesn't mean you have to say yes. And I write out, feel free to say no, but if you are interested, let me know and I'll send you the questions. I think that's a really powerful, really important thing to give people to remind people that they have the ability to say no, and it's perfectly fine. Some people are happy to give a testimonial and some are not. So I think the same concept applies here by making sure you explicitly say that and being okay with the answer, regardless of how much work you actually put into it. Because again, it's not your story to share, it's theirs. So they have to be happy with it.
Right, exactly. And especially because, they may dive into hard things. So, they may get to the end of it and be like, actually, I don't want to talk about that particular part of my story. Can you take that part out? They might not scrap the whole thing, but they might scrap part of it, or they might edit part of it. And really, I think if I was going to kind of sum up the EquaStory framework, it's about being in relationship with your client, with the story owner. Making sure that they feel comfortable with you, that they know you well, so that they can say no. Because it sounds very simple. Like, of course they can say no, but some of us need to be reminded that we can.
I mean, that's the purpose of any framework, right? Is to make sure you are going through some very important steps, that you don't forget things along the way.
Mm-hmm.
And having a guide or a framework can definitely help with that. So if people are interested in learning more about it, because obviously we just covered the surface here today, how can people get their hands on this EquaStory framework?
Yeah, so you can go to informedconsentconversations.abramarketing.com, and that's a really long URL to try to remember. So I will give you the link
Thanks.
for folks in the show notes.
And how can people get in touch with you if they do have follow-up questions for you as
Um,
well?
you can reach me. I'm on LinkedIn, Diana Farias Heinrich. You can also reach me on my website, abramarketing.com. That's Abra, Habra. And you can also catch me at the Ethical Nonprofit Summit.
And that is on and where?
That is June 4th through 6th. So the Ethical Nonprofit Summit it's a container for having this conversation, but way more in depth. And with experts that, are talking about trauma-informed storytelling, talking about assets-based language, talking about, why we need to do ethical storytelling in the first place. Because I only shared a handful of stories with y'all today. And so the Ethical Nonprofit Summit is really the container where you can come and find folks that, like me, that are doing this work in real time, which can be hard to do on your own. And depending on your organization, you may be fighting an uphill battle to do the right thing. And so it's really important to have a support network. And that's really what the Ethical Nonprofit Summit is about.
Awesome. Diana, thank you so much for joining me today. And thank you for building this kind of framework and making sure people are informed about how ethical storytelling can be most effective.
Absolutely. And just for your listeners, you can find the Ethical Nonprofit Summit at ethicalnonprofitsummit.com.
We'll put all those links, all the resources mentioned today, we'll put them in the show notes.
Beautiful. Thank
Thanks
you so
again.
much, Alex.
That's my pleasure. All right, that's it for today. I'm Alexander Lapa, and I hope you join me again in the next Agents of Nonprofit.